Somewhere off the northern tip of Newfoundland, a Norse ship noses through cold grey water and grinds against a pebbled shore. The crew that steps out is not lost. They knew roughly where they were going. They had sailed this route before, following stories passed down from men who had spotted wooded coastlines to the southwest of Greenland. Coastlines where timber grew in quantities that Greenland could never offer. They dragged the ship up, made camp, and began cutting trees. That moment, as best as science can now pin it, happened in 1021 CE. We know this not from a saga, not from a runic inscription, but from a spike in radiocarbon levels locked inside the wood of 3 pieces of timber excavated at a place called Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. A solar flare that year left a distinctive fingerprint in the atmosphere, and that fingerprint shows up in the rings of trees felled on that coast at that exact moment. The Vikings were there. We can date it to the year, and then within a generation they were gone. That is the fact that pulls at the imagination. Not that they came, but that they left. Because everything they needed was there. The timber that Greenland desperately lacked. Iron ore in the bogs. Grapes, or at least wild berries, rich enough to name a land after. And yet the settlement was abandoned. The forge went cold. The turf buildings slowly collapsed back into the ground, and stayed buried for nearly 900 years until Helge and Anne Ingstad walked the headland in 1960, and noticed that the humps and ridges in the earth were not natural. What those excavations eventually revealed was extraordinary. 8 timber-frame turf buildings, including a forge and a series of workshops, ironworking debris, around 800 artifacts that matched the designs of Norse Greenland and Iceland almost exactly. It became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978, and it remains the only confirmed 11th century Norse foothold anywhere in North America. No other site has passed the archaeological test that Meadows has passed. This is the real thing. The question is why it did not become something more. That question is what this video is built around. What if the settlement had lasted? What if the Norse had not retreated back to Greenland and eventually back into the silence of a civilization that Europe barely remembered? What changes? What kind of world do you get when a Norse colony takes root on the North American continent 4 centuries before Columbus crosses the Atlantic? To answer that seriously, you have to build it from the ground up, not from fantasy, but from archaeology, from the sagas read carefully against what the soil actually tells us, from the economic logic of ivory and iron, from what we now understand about the climate that shaped Norse expansion and eventually undermined it, and from what we know about the people who were already living across that continent when the longships arrived. The what-if only becomes meaningful when you understand the real, so that is exactly what this video does. We will look at the world the Norse came from, the pressures and ambitions that drove them across the North Atlantic in the first place. We will look at what Vinland genuinely offered, not just the romance of discovery, but the hard material calculus of timber, game, and access to trade routes. We will examine the indigenous peoples who met the Norse on those shores and what the evidence tells us about how those encounters unfolded. We will trace the strange afterlife of Norse America in myth, hoax, and memory, including a silver coin found in Maine that raises questions nobody has fully resolved. And we will follow the climate itself as a historical actor, watching the medieval climate optimum that eased Norse expansion gradually give way to the cooling that would eventually swallow Greenland whole. The alternate history we build from all of this is not a story where Vikings conquer America. It is something more interesting and more complicated than that. A permanent Norse settlement would have been small, dependent on trade, surrounded by peoples it could not dominate, and shaped by the same environmental pressures that defined life on the North Atlantic frontier. The question is whether those conditions could have produced something durable, and what ripples that durability might have sent forward through time toward the world we actually inherited. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. Meadows sits at the very edge of where the story could have gone, standing there today, looking out across the Strait of Belle Isle toward Labrador. It is easy to feel what the Norse must have felt when they first came ashore during the relatively mild years of the medieval climate optimum, when the North Atlantic was kinder than it would ever be again for several centuries. The sailing routes were open, the wind was manageable, the coast ahead was wooded and rich in a way that nothing between Norway and Newfoundland had been. They reached this shore, they built here, they worked iron and repaired ships and spent at least one winter, possibly more, and then they made a decision, or a series of decisions that ended with the ships pointing northeast, and the settlement left empty behind them. We're going to find out why, and then we're going to ask the question that historians usually resist, but that illuminates the real in ways nothing else quite can. What if the decision had gone the other way? To understand why the Norse reached Newfoundland at all, you have to resist the temptation to see them as explorers driven by curiosity or wanderlust. They were something more systematic than that. The Norse Atlantic expansion was not a series of accidents or heroic leaps into the unknown. It was a maritime system, built incrementally over generations, in which each new landfall became a platform for the next one, and in which the sea was not a barrier, but a highway connecting communities that had no other reliable way to stay alive. It begins in Scandinavia, where population pressure, political violence, and the inheritance customs of a warrior culture pushed men of ambition outward along the coasts and eventually far beyond them. Iceland was settled by Norse and Celtic peoples in the late 9th century and quickly became something extraordinary, a functioning society at the edge of the known world, organised around farming, fishing, and the kind of law-giving that men on a frontier invent when there is no king close enough to impose order. Iceland worked, and once it worked, it generated its own pressure, its own overcrowding, its own exiles. One of those exiles was Eric the Red. Around 982 CE, he was banished from Iceland for killing a neighbour in a feud, which was exactly the sort of biography that produced the next link in the chain. Rather than surrender to irrelevance, he sailed west following reports of a landmass spotted by earlier voyagers. He spent 3 years exploring a vast, largely ice-free coastline and came back with a salesman's gift for naming. He called it Greenland. Between 985 and 986 CE, 25 ships set out from Iceland to follow him. 14 made it, carrying settlers, livestock, timber, and everything necessary to begin again at the far edge of the ocean. They established the eastern and western settlements, and those communities would persist for 4 centuries. Eric the Red was a product of this frontier culture in its purest form, a man who responded to expulsion by founding a civilization. His son Leif Erikson was the next logical step. Sailing around 1000 CE, Leif pushed southwest from Greenland along a coastline that delivered in succession a treeless rocky shore he called Helleland, a forested coast he named Markland, and then the place the sagas call Vinland, rich enough in timber and food to sustain a winter camp and generate the kind of reports that brought subsequent expeditions. What made any of this possible was the ship. The Norse Nar was not a longship built for speed and raiding. It was a working vessel, clinker-built from overlapping oak planks, roughly 16 metres long, capable of carrying up to 30 tons of cargo, livestock, iron goods, timber, barrels of butter and dried fish. It could cruise at around 11 kilometres per hour across open ocean, which meant that the run from Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, and from Greenland to Labrador were all difficult but entirely manageable passages for crews who understood the sea as intimately as most people understand roads. Navigating those passages without instruments required something remarkable. The Norse apparently used what the sagas call sunstones, crystals of calcite, cordierite, or tourmaline that can polarize light and locate the sun even through cloud cover. Modern simulations suggest that taking readings every 3 hours with such a stone gave navigators a success rate of between 92 and 100% on the Norway to Greenland crossing. The North Atlantic was never tame, but it was legible to people who knew how to read it. What held this entire system together was economics, and the economics ran on walrus ivory. Greenland's primary export was tusks harvested from walrus along the western coasts, luxury goods that commanded high prices in European markets hungry for decorative carving material. As local stocks in southern Greenland were depleted, hunters pushed further north, into the waters above Baffin Bay, on voyages that required larger ships and crews of 15 to 40 men sailing 30-day expeditions into some of the harshest water in the world. Greenland was not a self-sufficient outpost of romantic adventurers. It was a node in a trading network, and its survival depended entirely on maintaining the connections that let it exchange ivory and furs for the timber, iron, and grain it could not produce itself. That dependency is the key that unlocks everything that follows. Vinland was not a dream or a rumour. It was the next logical address in a living network, a place where timber grew abundantly, where iron ore sat in the bogs, and where the same ships that already crossed the North Atlantic could reach in a matter of weeks from Greenland. The question was never whether the Norse could get there. They had already proven they could. The question was whether they could find a reason to stay. We now have an answer, or at least the closest thing to one that archaeology has ever produced. Not a decade, not a century, but a single year. The Norse were at Meadows in 1021 CE, and the way we know that is one of the more remarkable stories in the history of science meeting history itself. For most of the 20th century, dating the Norse presence in North America was an exercise in educated uncertainty. After the site at Meadows was first excavated in the 1960s by Helge and Ann Ingstad, conventional radiocarbon dating placed the settlement somewhere in a window spanning several centuries. That window was wide enough to accommodate doubt, wide enough for skeptics to question the timeline, and wide enough that the site, while accepted as genuinely Norse, sat in a kind of chronological fog. We knew the Norse had been there. We did not know when, not precisely, and in archaeology, precision is everything. The breakthrough came from the sun. In 993 CE, an extraordinary solar flare bombarded Earth's atmosphere with a pulse of cosmic radiation so intense that it left a measurable signature in the global carbon record. When that burst of energy struck the upper atmosphere, it converted a sudden surge of nitrogen into carbon-14, the radioactive isotope that makes radiocarbon dating possible in the first place. Trees growing during that year absorbed the spike as they laid down their rings, and because tree rings are annual, that anomaly is locked into a precise, identifiable layer in wood everywhere on Earth that was alive in 993 CE. Dendrochronologists call these events cosmogenic isotope spikes, and the 993 event is one of the sharpest and most clearly documented in the record. In 2021, a team of researchers led by Michael D. at the University of Groningen applied this to the wood remains from Meadows with extraordinary results. They identified the 993 CE carbon spike in the growth rings of 4 separate timber samples, recovered from the site, and by counting forward from that datable anomaly ring by ring, they arrived at a felling date for all 4 samples of exactly 1021 CE. The statistical confidence was striking, a 95% probability range of 1019 to 1024 CE, with the best single-year fit landing squarely on 1021, not around 1000 CE, not somewhere in the early medieval period, exactly 1021. This matters in ways that reach beyond the headline. Radiocarbon dating has always carried inherent imprecision because the atmospheric concentration of carbon-14 fluctuates naturally over time, producing what scientists call a plateau effect in certain periods where a range of actual dates all produce the same measured result. For much of the early medieval era, conventional radiocarbon dating returns a smear of possibilities rather than a point. The solar flare method sidesteps that problem entirely by anchoring the measurement to an event that left a sharp, unambiguous signature in the record. It is the difference between knowing someone arrived in a particular decade and knowing they arrived in a particular year. And that shift in precision fundamentally changes the conversation. It removes the chronological fog. It gives us a fixed coordinate from which to reason. What that fixed coordinate anchors is a site that, once you look at it carefully, was clearly no fleeting visit. The archaeology at Meadows is not the archaeology of a campfire and a few discarded items. It is the archaeology of a functioning, organised operation. The settlement comprised 4 main hall complexes and several associated outbuildings, capable of sheltering somewhere between 70 and 90 people. Crucially, different areas of the site show different patterns of activity in ways that tell us something about the people who lived there. One area contains the evidence of ironworking, a stone-lined furnace, slag deposits, and iron nail fragments that had been deliberately cut and trimmed. Iron smelting is not a casual undertaking. It requires a prepared furnace, specific ore, controlled airflow, and skilled labour. Someone at Meadows in 1021 was producing iron from local bog ore, which means they came prepared to do exactly that, and they stayed long enough to make it worth doing. The nails, many of them cut to shorter lengths rather than simply discarded, almost certainly came from boat repair work in a dedicated lean-to structure adjacent to the main buildings. Ships crossing the North Atlantic sustained constant wear. A settlement that could smelt iron and fabricate replacement fasteners was a settlement capable of sustaining the vessels that connected it to the wider Norse world. Then there is the carpentry. The woodworking debris recovered from the site is extensive. Post shavings, plank fragments, birch bark rolls, and a recovered boat plank fitted with tree nails, the wooden pegs used in clinker-built Norse construction. The sheer volume of waste material speaks to sustained, large-scale work. Timber was being shaped for the halls, for roofing, and for a small vessel estimated at roughly 8 meters in length. The wood was being managed, processed, and used with the efficiency of people who understood its value and intended to be there long enough to make use of everything they cut. And then there are the smaller details, the ones that archaeologists call activity markers and that historians use to reconstruct the texture of daily life. A spindle whorl, used for spinning thread, places women at the site. A bone needle. These objects do not appear in raiding parties or purely commercial expeditions. They appear in communities. The presence of women and the gendered division of space within the hall complexes, male activity zones centered on metalworking and boat repair, female zones associated with textile production, suggests something that was organized along the lines of a settlement rather than a military or trading camp. We should be careful not to overread this. The archaeologists who have studied the site most carefully are explicit that the question of duration remains genuinely open. The occupation may have been a series of seasonal stays rather than continuous habitation, years perhaps, rather than decades, and the 1021 CE date reflects when those particular trees were felled, which gives us the outermost limit of that specific occupation, not necessarily the full story of how long Norse people used the site across multiple visits. The archaeology cannot yet resolve whether this was one extended stay or the most intensively documented of several shorter ones. But what it cannot be is a mistake. The 1021 dating and the physical evidence together establish something that no amount of saga skepticism can undo. In the early 11th century, Norse men and women built halls, smelted iron, repaired ships, and worked wood at a site on the northern tip of Newfoundland. They were organized, they were equipped. They left a clear and coherent archaeological signature that modern science can now place within a year of its creation. It took us nearly 1,000 years to read it properly. The site was known to local residents for generations before the Ingstads arrived. The sagas had preserved the memory of Vinland in fragmentary, mythologized form across centuries during which European scholars alternatively dismissed, romanticized, and argued over what they meant. The 1960s excavations proved the Norse were there. The 2021 dating study told us precisely when. Each generation of science added resolution to a picture that earlier generations could only sketch in outline. That matters for what comes next in this story, because the question we're about to ask is a historical counterfactual, a structured exercise in imagining what might have been different, and that kind of question needs a firm foundation. Speculation built on uncertain ground is just fantasy, but speculation anchored to a dated, excavated, physically documented reality is something else. It is reasoning from evidence about the weight of contingency, about how much the shape of the world depended on decisions made by people who could not see the consequences. So, 1021 CE Lonso Meadows, 70 to 90 people, iron tools, repaired ships, spinning thread, fresh-cut timber, a community at the edge of a continent that Europe would not officially reach again for nearly 500 years. They were there, they were real, they were capable. What if they had stayed? To answer that question honestly, you have to start with what was actually on offer. And what was on offer, if you approached the northeastern coast of North America in 1021 with a Norse sailor's eye, was extraordinary. Begin with the forests. Anyone who has walked the subarctic landscape of southern Greenland understands almost immediately what the absence of trees means. Greenland's Norse settlers built their halls from turf, not timber, because substantial timber simply did not exist in the quantities needed for construction. What little wood they had came from driftwood harvested along the shore, logs carried by ocean currents from Siberian river systems, occasionally supplemented by careful, expensive imports. Recent isotopic analysis of wood remains from Norse Greenlandic sites has confirmed just how desperately scarce imported timber was. Only a tiny fraction of recovered wood assemblages, well under 1%, can be traced to oak, beech, pine or jack pine brought deliberately from elsewhere. The rest is whatever the sea provided. In practical terms, this meant that every structural decision a Greenlandic Norse builder made was constrained by the shortage of the material most fundamental to Norse civilization. Halls, ships, tools, barrels, furniture, all of it competed for the same inadequate supply. Now stand on the Labrador coast and look inland. The sagas name this stretch of land Markland, a word that requires no translation for anyone who sees it. Mark simply means forest land. The taiga of Labrador offered spruce, fir and pine in densities that no Norse Greenlander would have encountered at home. Trees of the size and straightness needed not just for buildings, but for the structural timbers of ocean-going ships. The Norse knew exactly what they were looking at. They gave it a name that was, by the standards of medieval geography, practically a declaration of value. Think about what wood meant to a seafaring culture. A single Viking-era longship required roughly 400 kilograms of iron just for its fastening nails, around 7,000 of them driven through overlapping strakes of clinker-built planking. The hull timbers themselves demanded oak of specific curvature, grown at particular angles, which takes generations of forest management to produce reliably. A ship that crossed the North Atlantic absorbed punishment with every voyage. Strained planks, sprung fastenings, cracks and splits that needed fresh timber for repair. The smithy at Meadows, with its iron-working hearth and its deliberately trimmed nail fragments, was not incidental to the settlement. It was the settlement's reason for being, at least in part. A base where ships could be worked on, where iron could be forged from local bog ore, where fresh timber could be shaped into hull planks, was a base that could keep a Norse Atlantic fleet operational. Without it, every vessel that sailed west of Greenland was sailing toward eventual incapacity, carrying repairs it could not make and consuming wood it could not replace. Beyond Markland, the sagas describe a land the Norse called Vinland. The name is older and stranger than Markland, and scholars have argued over it ever since the manuscripts were first studied seriously. The most appealing interpretation, and the one that captured centuries of European imagination, is that Vin means wine, and that Vinland was named for the wild grapes that Norse explorers found growing there. Wild grapes, Vitis riparia, do grow along the northeastern coast of North America, and their presence in saga descriptions has a plausibility to it that is hard to dismiss entirely. Grapes and grape-derived products were luxury goods in the Norse world, valuable for trade, and a land that produced them would have been worth naming for the fact. But an older reading of Vin, one that Norse philologists have championed, is simply meadow or pasture. In that interpretation, Vinland means something closer to grassland or meadowland, a name pointing at the kind of open grazing territory that Norse pastoralists who kept cattle, horses and sheep would have recognised immediately as agricultural potential. The Meadows site itself sits in exactly this kind of coastal meadow, and there are scholars who believe the name preserves a memory of that specific geography. Both readings have force, and the uncertainty is itself revealing. It tells us that the Norse were cataloguing the continent's resources the way explorers always do, reaching for the most economically legible feature of each new stretch of coastline, and assigning it a name that advertised its utility. Helluland, the third of the saga lands, translates as flat stone land, which corresponds well to the rock-strewn coastline of Baffin Island. Helluland offered little that the Norse wanted. Markland offered timber. Vinland offered, depending on which reading you prefer, either agricultural land or luxury produce, and possibly both. The naming sequence reads like a prospectus. Underneath all three names, however, the material reality of what Vinland and Markland could provide was consistent and substantial. The rivers and coastal waters of Newfoundland and Labrador were full of Atlantic salmon and cod, in quantities that a Norse fisherman from the North Atlantic would have recognised as genuinely staggering. Game was abundant in ways Greenland simply could not match. Caribou in large herds, beaver, deer, waterfowl in seasonal multitudes. A Norse community that could exploit these resources had a protein base entirely unlike the marginal, unreliable agriculture of Greenland, where the growing season was short, the soil thin, and livestock had to survive winters that could collapse a herd in a single bad year. Then there was the iron. Greenland's Norse population depended on imported iron and on the careful recycling of every fragment they possessed. Iron goods were precious. They were traded, inherited, repaired beyond any reasonable expectation of service life, and eventually buried with the dead when they could no longer be used. The bog iron deposits of Newfoundland and Labrador, the same ferrous sediments that prehistoric peoples across the boreal zone had long understood as a resource, were accessible to anyone who knew what to look for in waterlogged ground. The iron-working hearth at Meadows confirms that the Norse found these deposits and used them. The ore smelted at that hearth became the nails in the boats that could continue sailing. It was the difference between a community that was consuming its last reserves and one that could replenish them. The honest assessment of all this is not that Vinland was an obvious paradise that any rational person would have rushed to settle permanently. It was not. The climate of Newfoundland in the early 11th century, though warmer than what came later, was still demanding. The distance from Europe was immense, representing the outermost limit of what Norse maritime technology could sustain across open ocean. And the land was occupied, a reality the sagas record with some clarity, and to which we will return, one that would have shaped any attempt at permanent settlement in ways that are not simple to predict. But the resource inventory, measured against the one place the Norse were actually trying to build a civilization in the Western Atlantic, tilts decisively. Greenland had the geography, the position, and the existing community. Vinland and Markland had nearly everything else: timber for ships and halls, bog iron for the nails that held both together, fish, game, and potentially pasture land to feed whoever lived there. The Norse were not discovering an unreadable wilderness. They were looking at a landscape that, in multiple different registers, answered the specific scarcities that were grinding down their Greenlandic settlements year by year. What Meadows represents, in this light, is not the full extent of what a Norse North American presence might have looked like. It was a base camp, a staging point, a place to repair ships and process timber before moving on or sending loads back to Greenland. But staging points have a way of becoming permanent when the logic of resources makes permanence more rational than retreat. The question was never really whether Vinland had enough to offer. It clearly did. The question was whether the people who sailed there could find a way to stay, and what standing in the way of that was not geography or resources, but the fact that several thousand years of human history had arrived there first. When the Norse ships came ashore at Meadows, they did not step onto empty ground. They stepped into a world that had been organized, navigated, named, and inhabited for thousands of years before any European keel disturbed its waters. The single most consequential fact about any Norse attempt at North American settlement is not the timber, or the iron, or the latitude. It is this: the land already had people in it, and those people had their own politics, their own trade routes, and their own capacity to decide whether newcomers were useful or dangerous. Understanding who those people were requires some care, because the sources that describe them are imprecise in ways that matter. The sagas call them skraelings. The word appears in 13th century Icelandic manuscripts, written down generations after the voyages they describe, and it functions as a catch-all label that obscures as much as it reveals. We do not know with certainty what the word originally meant. Some scholars have read it as something close to barbarian or wretch, others as simply foreigner, and the ambiguity embedded in the etymology is appropriate, because the Norse applied the same term to peoples across an enormous geographic and cultural range. The Skraelings of Vinland were not the same people as the Skraelings of Greenland. Labelling them identically was a Norse failure of perception, not an ethnographic fact. The sagas tell us something about how the Norse saw these encounters. They tell us almost nothing reliable about the cultures on the receiving end. What we can reconstruct from archaeology is more granular. The northeastern coastline of North America in 1021 was not a single cultural world, but several overlapping ones. In the high Arctic, the Dorset people, who had occupied the region since roughly 700 CE, were still present and active. Further south, along Labrador and Newfoundland, the ancestors of the Beothuk and Innu occupied coastal and interior territories that had supported sustained communities across centuries. These were not populations on the margins of subsistence. They were peoples who had developed sophisticated maritime economies, intimate knowledge of seasonal resource cycles, and extensive trade networks that moved materials across distances the Norse would have recognized as oceanic in scale. The Norse arrived as strangers into a world that already had its own geography of exchange. The saga accounts of first contact oscillate between wariness and violence in ways that feel historically plausible, even if the specific details cannot be verified. It is worth being explicit about this. When the sagas describe individual encounters, they are doing so through the filter of oral transmission, subsequent transcription, and the literary conventions of 13th century Icelandic writing. The numbers reported, the specific words exchanged, the precise sequence of events, all of it passed through multiple layers before reaching the manuscripts we now read. What survives is not a transcript of what happened on a Newfoundland beach in 1021. It is a memory of a memory shaped by the priorities of the people who eventually wrote it down. With that caveat firmly in place, the patterns the sagas record are still instructive. Thorvald Eriksson's party, in one account, encountered 9 men sleeping under upturned boats and killed 8 of them without provocation. A retaliatory attack followed. That sequence, unprovoked aggression leading to sustained hostility, is one model of first contact. A different saga describes Thorfinn Karlsefni's expedition, exchanging red cloth for furs at a place called Hop, the Norse and the Skraelings conducting wary commerce across a boundary of mutual uncertainty. That sequence, tentative exchange building something that might become trust, is the other model. Both outcomes were available, and which one prevailed in any given encounter likely depended on variables the sagas do not fully record. How many people were present on each side, whether earlier encounters had primed local communities toward hospitality or suspicion, whether individual personalities on either shore tipped a moment of ambiguity toward violence or restraint. The archaeology cannot adjudicate between these two saga episodes, but it does something arguably more significant. It shows that the relationship between Norse visitors and indigenous communities was not limited to the brief volatile encounters the written record emphasizes. Norse origin objects, including iron nails, bronze crucibles, and whetstones bearing evidence of European metalworking, have been recovered from Dorset and Inuit archaeological sites across a stretch of territory spanning roughly 1,500 kilometres of Baffin Island and northern Labrador. These objects did not travel that far by accident. They moved through indigenous hands, passing between communities along trade networks that were already ancient by the time the Norse arrived. A piece of Norse iron recovered 1,000 kilometres from any site the Norse are known to have occupied is not evidence of Norse exploration of that territory. It is evidence of indigenous trade systems absorbing Norse material culture and distributing it according to their own economic logic. What's equally striking is that the exchange was not unidirectional. A soapstone lamp of Dorset manufacture was found inside one of the Norse structures at Lonso Meadows itself. Indigenous objects were present in the Norse settlement, which means that at least some encounters produced an exchange substantial enough to leave a trace in both directions. The boundary between Norse and indigenous worlds was permeable from the beginning, not in a way that erased either culture's distinctiveness, but in a way that created a zone of material contact where both sides were acquiring things that the other could produce. This matters enormously for the counterfactual. Any Norse colony that persisted beyond the initial season of exploration would have existed inside that zone, not on its edge. The Lonso-Meadows camp could function as a transient base partly because it made limited demands on the surrounding landscape and on the communities already inhabiting it. A permanent settlement, the kind that brought women, children, livestock and the intention to stay, would have made entirely different demands: cleared land, assured food access, the ability to fish and hunt across territory that already had established users. The moment Norse settlement shifted from seasonal exploitation to year-round occupation, the question of indigenous relations stopped being a peripheral concern and became the central one. The sagas suggest that this pressure arrived quickly. Karlsefni's colony at Hop, which the saga describes as lasting perhaps 2 years, fell apart not because the Norse lacked resources, but because the cumulative weight of contact, possibly including misunderstandings, resource competition, or the sheer psychological stress of being surrounded by a numerically larger and territorially established population, made continued presence untenable. Whether that account is literally accurate is impossible to verify, but its structural logic is persuasive. A small Norse community, numbering perhaps a few hundred people at most in even the most optimistic projections, was never going to overwhelm the indigenous presence in the northeastern woodlands by force. They lacked the numbers and the immunological advantage that later European colonizers would tragically deploy. In 1021, the Norse were simply outnumbered, in unfamiliar terrain, dependent on sea lanes that stretched back 3,000 kilometers to any substantial Norse population center. This is why the relationship between Norse settlers and nearby indigenous communities was not just an ethical dimension of a potential permanent colony, it was the operational dimension. A Norse colony in Vinland that failed to establish reliable, mutually beneficial relationships with the communities around it was a colony that would be abandoned or destroyed. A colony that managed to become genuinely useful to its neighbours as a source of iron, goods, cloth and other materials that indigenous communities valued would have had something to offer in return for the tolerance, the knowledge, and the local political support that survival required. We know that indigenous trade networks were already moving Norse objects southward and westward across the continent. We know that Norse structures at Meadows contained indigenous artifacts. We know that the Norse and the peoples they met were, at least sometimes and in at least some places, exchanging things. The beginning of a relationship was already there, fragile, uncertain, and prone to catastrophic misreading, but present. Whether it could have been extended, deepened, and transformed into the kind of economic partnership that made permanence possible is the question on which everything else in this story ultimately turns. To understand why Norse sailors kept returning to the edges of the known world, you have to understand what they were actually selling. The voyages were not romantic wandering. They were not driven primarily by a desire for discovery or a need to plant flags in unfamiliar ground. They were driven by the same force that has propelled most long-distance maritime expansion throughout human history, the logic of a market with an appetite it could not satisfy close to home. The commodity that made the Norse Atlantic economy function was walrus ivory. In 11th century Europe, ivory was a prestige material of the first order. It carved into religious objects, chess pieces, decorative handles, and the kinds of portable luxury goods that wealthy patrons and cathedral builders were willing to pay for in quantities that made dangerous voyages economically rational. African elephant ivory reached Europe through Islamic trade intermediaries, which made it expensive and geopolitically complicated. Walrus ivory, which is structurally different from elephant ivory but serviceable for many of the same purposes, could be harvested from Arctic waters and shipped directly to European markets by Norse traders who controlled the supply chain from animal to buyer. DNA analysis of ivory objects in European ecclesiastical collections has confirmed that a substantial portion of them came from Greenland's western walrus populations. Animals hunted thousands of kilometers from the chapels and counting houses where their tusks eventually ended up. That supply chain is not a minor historical footnote. It is the economic foundation on which Norse Greenland was built, and it is what connected the settlement at Vinland to something larger than itself. Greenland's Norse community, at its height numbering perhaps 5,000 people, sustained a bishopric and a trading relationship with European merchants that required a continuous stream of exportable value. Walrus ivory was the anchor commodity, but the ships that carried it were not carrying only ivory. The broader inventory of Norse Atlantic exchange included seal hides for rope and clothing, live polar bears occasionally presented as gifts to European royalty, furs taken from Arctic foxes and other northern mammals, and something that would only grow in importance over time, timber. Greenland itself had almost none. Iceland had little. Northern Europe's demand for ship timber and construction wood was substantial and persistent, and the forests of Markland, the coastline the Norse identified south of Vinland, offered a supply that Scandinavia's own depleted woodlands increasingly could not. The sagas record Norse expeditions specifically to Markland for timber long after the formal settlement attempts at Vinland had ended. Those voyages were not nostalgia trips. They were practical logistics, the equivalent of running a supply barge to a quarry. What this commerce establishes is that the Norse relationship with North America did not require permanent settlement to leave an economic footprint. A colony at Vinland, positioned at the junction of the timber coast, the northern fur trade, and the Atlantic sea lanes connecting Greenland to Iceland and Iceland to Norway, would have been embedded in a working trade system from its first winter. Its survival did not depend solely on agricultural self-sufficiency or military dominance of its surroundings. It could have functioned as a node in a network, exporting raw materials that the wider Norse world needed, and receiving in return the metal goods, cloth, grain, and manufactured objects that a small frontier community could not produce for itself. Commerce, rather than conquest, was always the more plausible basis for a lasting presence. The archaeological record supports this broader picture, with a consistency that individual artifact interpretations sometimes obscure. Norse objects, including iron, copper alloy fragments, and worked wool, have been found across a belt of Arctic and subarctic sites, associated with Dorset and later Inuit cultures, spanning from Baffin Island through northern Labrador, over a geographic range that no Norse expedition is known to have directly explored. These objects did not fall from the sky. They travelled through indigenous hands, moving along the same inter-community exchange routes that had been distributing materials across the North American Arctic for centuries before the Norse arrived. The Norse were plugging into a network that already existed, and that network was capable of carrying Norse origin material far beyond any Norse boot print on the ground. The directionality worked both ways, as the soapstone lamp of Dorset manufacture found inside the Lonceau Meadows settlement already demonstrated, but the most geographically striking evidence for how far indigenous trade routes could carry Norse material southward is a small silver coin recovered from a shell midden at a site in Brooklyn, Maine, nearly 2,000 kilometres from Newfoundland. The coin is genuine. Metallurgical analysis has confirmed it as an 11th century Norse penny, minted during the reign of Olaf III of Norway, placing its manufacture squarely within the period of the Lonceau Meadows occupation. Archaeologists who have studied its context most carefully have concluded that the coin almost certainly did not arrive in Maine because a Norse sailor walked ashore there. It arrived because indigenous trade networks reaching from the Gulf of Maine northward to communities in contact with Norse settlements were efficient enough to move a single silver coin across a continent's worth of coastline before anyone wrote down that such a thing was possible. A Norse penny found in Maine is not evidence of Norse exploration of Maine. It is evidence of how far Norse economic influence could extend without Norse people physically being present. That distinction matters enormously for thinking about a sustained Vinland colony. The historical tendency has been to measure Norse presence by the direct archaeological footprint. How many Norse structures can we identify? How far south can we place Norse people in the flesh? But commerce does not work that way. A trading post at the tip of Newfoundland could have generated economic influence across 1,000 kilometres of coastline simply by being reliable, by offering iron goods that indigenous communities valued highly, and by being accessible to the trade networks that already linked those communities to each other. Norse iron was not just useful to the people who received it directly. It was a trade good that retained value as it moved, which means a Norse settlement with a consistent supply of metal could have become a gravitational centre for indigenous exchange networks across a region far larger than any Norse community could have physically occupied. This is what a commerce-driven model of Norse permanence looks like when you follow its logic. The colony at Vinland would not have needed to expand territorially to expand its economic reach. It would have needed to be stable, productive, and sufficiently well connected to the walrus ivory economy of the north that European merchants had a reason to send ships, and sufficiently well positioned in local exchange networks that indigenous communities had a reason to trade rather than to drive the newcomers off. Both conditions were achievable. Neither required the kind of overwhelming demographic pressure or military dominance that European colonization of North America would later deploy so catastrophically. There is something almost ironic in this picture. The Norse failure in Vinland has traditionally been framed as a story about overreach, about small numbers of people attempting to hold ground they lack the power to defend. But the evidence from the broader Norse Atlantic trade system suggests a different failure mode. Not that commerce was impossible, but that it was not organised around the right model. The Norse who came to Vinland came primarily as farmers and warriors, looking for land they could clear, hold, and pass to their children. The Norse who kept coming back to Markland came as loggers and hunters, extracting what they needed and sailing home. The second model was actually working, in the narrow sense that those expeditions continued for centuries. What never quite materialised was the synthesis between them. A settled community that could serve as a permanent commercial hub without trying to impose the full weight of Norse agrarian life onto a landscape that already had its own deeply entrenched human geography. The trade networks were real. The economic logic was sound. The materials that Vinland could supply, timber, furs, and eventually fish on a scale that the Norwegian Sea could not indefinitely sustain, were materials that European markets would eventually consume in enormous quantities. The question was never whether there was a commercial rationale for staying. The question was whether anyone could build a community patient and flexible enough to make the staying work, and the answer to that question ran straight through the people who were already there, who already controlled the trade routes, and who would ultimately decide on their own terms whether the Norse newcomers at the edge of the ocean were partners worth keeping. In 1957, two amateur archaeologists named Guy Melgren and Ed Runge were excavating a shell midden on the Blue Hill Peninsula of Brooklyn, Maine, a site known as Goddard or Naskag Point, a layered deposit left behind by Wabanaki people over many generations of coastal habitation. Among the objects they recovered was something that had no obvious reason to be there: a small silver coin, worn thin, perforated near its edge as though it had once been strung and worn as a pendant. It was roughly the size of a thumbnail. When numismatic experts eventually examined it, including Kolbjørn Skare of the University of Oslo, they identified it without serious dispute as a Norse penny minted during the reign of King Olaf III of Norway, known as Olaf Kyrre the Peaceful. The coin dated to somewhere between 1067 and 1093, placing its manufacture squarely within the century that followed the Meadows occupation. It remains to this day the only pre-Columbian Norse artifact found within the borders of the United States that the broader scholarly community regards as genuinely authentic. The coin's existence raises a question that is much more interesting than it first appears, because the obvious question, did Vikings reach Maine, is almost certainly the wrong one to ask. Brooklyn, Maine sits roughly 2,000 kilometers south of the Norse settlement at Meadows. There is no archaeological evidence of a Norse outpost anywhere between Newfoundland and the Gulf of Maine. No post holes, no iron slag, no Norse-style structural debris has turned up along that coastline to suggest that a Norse crew made landfall, traded directly with coastal communities in what is now Maine, and then left a silver coin behind as accidental evidence of the visit. The straightforward interpretation that a Norse sailor walked ashore at Naskig Point is not supported by the surrounding record, and most researchers who have worked with the coin have moved away from it for that reason. What the coin does suggest, and what makes it genuinely compelling as a historical object, is something considerably more subtle. The Goddard site where it was recovered was a place of active trade and exchange among indigenous communities along the northeastern seaboard. The Wabanaki peoples who used that site were part of a network of relationships that stretched up and down the coast and, critically, northward through a chain of communities connecting southern New England to the maritime provinces, to Labrador, and eventually to the communities of the subarctic, who were themselves in intermittent contact with Norse settlements and Norse-influenced Inuit groups further north. A Norse coin does not need a Norse carrier to travel 2,000 kilometers through that kind of network. It only needs to be valuable enough to trade, distinctive enough to retain its identity as a desirable object, and part of a system in which goods moved fluidly between communities across enormous distances over time. The perforation is telling in this regard. A coin that has been drilled and worn as a pendant is a coin that someone valued not as currency, which would have been functionally meaningless in a non-Norse economy, but as an object, as metal, as ornament, as a portable piece of something exotic and rare. Norse iron was prized across the subarctic precisely because indigenous metalworking in the region could not easily replicate it. A silver coin from Norway, arriving in a Maine coastal community 2 or 3 degrees of separation removed from any Norse contact point, would have been strange and striking, the kind of object that moved through gift exchange and prestige trade rather than casual commerce. Its presence at Goddard says less about where Norse people went than about how far their material world could reach without them. There is, however, a competing interpretation that cannot be dismissed, and responsible engagement with the coin requires sitting with the discomfort it creates. Guy Melgren, one of the 2 men who claimed to have found the penny, was a serious coin collector with broad access to numismatic material, including potentially authentic medieval Scandinavian coins. The excavation at the Goddard site was not conducted under conditions that would satisfy modern archaeological standards. There are no stratigraphic records documenting exactly where and at what depth the coin was found, no contemporaneous field notes establishing its context beyond Melgren's own account. The Goddard site's main cultural horizon dates to roughly 1180 to 1235, which is somewhat later than the Norse coin's minting period, creating an awkward chronological gap that a genuine trade route would need to account for. Robert Hoag of the American Numismatic Society has gone so far as to characterize the find as probably a hoax, a conclusion that reflects not doubt about the coin's Norse origin, which is metallurgically confirmed, but serious doubt about whether it arrived in that midden through any pre-Columbian means at all. This is where the Maine penny becomes not just a historical puzzle, but a kind of parable about artifact interpretation more broadly. The coin is real. The reign of Olaf III is real. The perforation is real. But the chain of custody connecting those facts to a specific moment of deposition in a coastal Maine midden is broken. And a broken chain of custody is an opening through which both romance and fraud can enter. The history of Norse exploration in North America is littered with objects that began as mysteries and resolved into forgeries. The Kensington runestone in Minnesota, the the Newport Towers' contested origins, any number of runic inscriptions that collapsed under scrutiny, all of them illustrate the same pattern. The desire for a story is powerful enough to manufacture evidence when evidence is scarce, and the desire to find Norse presence in places far beyond Newfoundland has been intense enough to motivate deception as well as scholarship. The main penny resists easy resolution in either direction, and that resistance is itself informative. If it is genuine in the fullest sense, meaning both authentically Norse and authentically pre-Columbian in its deposition at Goddard, then it is the most dramatic evidence available for how far indigenous trade networks could carry Norse material culture southward from the known contact zone. It would place a Norse origin object in a Wabanaki community perhaps 2 centuries after the Lonso Meadows settlement and hundreds of kilometres from any confirmed Norse site, which would mean that the Norse economic footprint extended far deeper into the northeastern seaboard than their physical presence ever did. That conclusion would reinforce everything that the broader archaeological record from Dorset and Inuit sites in the subarctic already suggests, that objects move through indigenous networks with a fluency and range that European settlers of any era consistently underestimated. If the coin is a hoax, it becomes a different kind of evidence, not about Norse explorers, but about how much people in the 20th century wanted Norse explorers to have been there. Mellgren and Runge were working in the 1950s, when popular interest in Viking America was substantial, and the scholarly apparatus for scrutinizing such finds was less developed than it would later become. A coin introduced into a dig, whether deliberately or carelessly, tells a story about the mythology of Norse discovery that has always shadowed the actual archaeology. The persistent wish to push the frontier of Norse contact further, earlier, and deeper into the American continent than the evidence can honestly support. What the main penny does most reliably, regardless of which interpretation is ultimately correct, is illustrate the particular challenge of reading isolated artifacts against the grain of their own silence. Objects do not come with explanations. A perforated silver coin in a coastal midden could be a relic of subarctic trade networks operating across a 1,000-kilometre chain of indigenous exchange. It could be a collector's coin dropped into a midden by a man who wanted to believe in Vikings. It could be something in between, a genuine Norse coin that found its way into a collection and then into a dig through entirely mundane 20th century means, with no Norse sailor and no indigenous trade route in the picture at all. The coin itself cannot tell you which story is true. What it can do, and what it has done for nearly 7 decades since its recovery, is force the question. It sits at the boundary between evidence and wish, between what the Norse Atlantic trade system could plausibly have accomplished and what the human appetite for a grander story tends to impose on the past. And in that boundary position, it is a more honest artifact than it might appear, because that tension between what we can demonstrate and what we want to believe runs through every part of the Vinland story, from the sagas themselves down to the most rigorous modern excavation report. The penny is small, the questions it carries are not. The main penny asks what Norse material culture could accomplish without Norse people behind it. But turn the question around, and it becomes something more demanding. What would Norse people have needed to actually stay? Meadows was not a failed colony in the way the word failure usually implies. It was, by every measure of its physical remains, a functioning outpost. The people who lived there between roughly 1021 and some uncertain departure date could smelt iron, repair ships, process timber, and shelter through an Atlantic winter. They left behind nail fragments, rivets, a bone needle, the slag of a small forge. These are not the traces of a doomed expedition improvising in panic. They are the traces of skilled people doing skilled work in a place they understood well enough to work in. What they apparently could not do, or did not do, was stay long enough for the site to accumulate the deeper material signature of permanence, the graves, the field systems, the generations of refuse that mark the difference between a workshop and a home. The gap between those two things is not primarily a gap of courage or ambition. It is a gap of scale, organisation, and institutions. And understanding that gap is the closest we can get to answering what a surviving Norse colony would have actually required. Start with population, because nothing else functions without it. Norse Greenland at its peak housed somewhere around 2,500 people, spread across 2 settlement districts, and a scattering of farms reaching toward the northern hunting grounds. That population was always precarious, always dependent on resupply from Iceland and Norway for iron, grain, and timber, always balanced between the land's thin agricultural capacity and the maritime economy that supplemented it. Archaeologists who have worked through the demographic logic of Norse settlement in the North Atlantic generally conclude that a viable permanent outpost at Vinland would have needed somewhere in the range of 30 to 50 families, perhaps 150 to 250 people, to sustain itself through a single bad year without catastrophic loss. That is roughly the scale of the smallest functioning Icelandic farms of the period, a number large enough to maintain a labour pool, absorb mortality, care for livestock through winter, and keep complex technical skills alive rather than dying with the one person who possessed them. The people sent to Meadows, however many there were, almost certainly did not reach that threshold, and this matters enormously, because a small group of skilled men in a temporary camp is fundamentally different in character from a community with distributed labour, intergenerational knowledge, and the social density needed to solve unforeseen problems without sending back to Greenland for help. This is where women enter the picture, not as a token of inclusion, but as a structural necessity. What made Norse settlements across the North Atlantic self-sustaining was not the capacity to sail or to fight, impressive as those capacities were. It was the domestic economy managed by women, the wool processing and weaving that produced cloth sufficient for trade, as well as local use, the dairy management that kept goat and sheep herds productive through harsh seasons, the textile crafts that supplied rope for ships, sails for rigging, and the ordinary fabric of daily life that no settlement can do without indefinitely. Cloth in the North Atlantic was not a luxury. It was currency, trade good, and infrastructure all at once. The spindle whirl and the loom weight were as strategically important as the forge. A Vinland colony without women was, by definition, a colony without a future. Add to that the question of skilled artisans, and the picture becomes clearer still. The ironworking evidence at Meadows is rudimentary by Old World standards, but significant by North American ones. The Norse settlers could manufacture and repair iron objects on site. In the context of a continent where metallurgy of that kind was entirely absent, that capacity was not merely useful. It was a singular strategic advantage, the kind of capability that would have given a permanent Norse colony enormous leverage in trade relationships with neighbouring indigenous communities. Iron tools, iron weapons, iron fasteners were objects that travelled extraordinary distances through indigenous exchange networks, as the broader subarctic record consistently demonstrates. A colony that could produce them reliably, rather than importing them at great cost in irregular intervals from Greenland, would have held a position in the regional economy that no other group could easily replicate or displace. The same logic applies to shipbuilding and timber. Vinland's forests were not simply a scenic backdrop. They were the entire reason Greenland needed Vinland in the first place. A treeless North Atlantic island cannot build or maintain a fleet without access to boreal timber, and the Norse understood this acutely. Markland, the forested coast south of Vinland in the saga accounts, is mentioned explicitly as a timber source, even in sources that treat Vinland itself as primarily a settlement prospect. A permanent colony controlling access to prime North American timber would have been supplying one of the most critical material shortages in the entire Norse Atlantic system. It would have had something to offer Greenland and Iceland that those places genuinely needed, and that economic logic would have pulled resupply voyages toward it, rather than requiring Vinland to depend entirely on irregular charity from a struggling Greenlandic base. The export economy more broadly is worth dwelling on. 3 commodities in particular stood ready to make a Vinland colony financially intelligible to the Norse world that would have needed to fund it. Cod from the Newfoundland banks was among the richest fisheries in the known Atlantic, capable of producing dried and salted fish in quantities that would have been enormously valuable in European markets. Eiderdown from the dense nesting colonies of the Newfoundland coast was another high-value, low-weight export that required no special technology to harvest. And walrus ivory, the commodity that had already driven Norse expansion to the edges of the Arctic and financed Greenland's entire relationship with Europe, was accessible from hunting grounds not far north of Vinland's own latitude. A colony with those 3 commodities and the timber to keep its ships functional was not a drain on the Norse world. It was a productive node in a transatlantic economy that already existed. But goods and skills and numbers are not sufficient on their own, and this is the point that tends to get lost in discussions that treat Norse exploration as primarily a story of heroic individuals making brave decisions. What turns a camp into a settlement is not any single act of will. It is the slow accumulation of routines, the calendar of planting and harvest and fishing, the social structures that allocate labour and resolve disputes, the religious rhythms and seasonal ceremonies that bind a community to a place over time. Norse Greenland had those things, imperfectly and under constant pressure, but it had them. Lonso Meadows, as far as the archaeological record can tell us, did not develop them. The site reads like a place where people worked and then left, rather than a place where people worked and began to live. A colony that survived would have needed to cross that threshold, which meant regular and committed resupply from Greenland or Iceland, not occasional voyages when conditions allowed, but something closer to an annual obligation, the kind of institutional relationship that turned a distant outpost into an acknowledged part of a political and economic system. It would have needed to be recognised, named and governed, if that word is not too grand for early 11th century Norse arrangements, meaning it would have needed someone responsible for it, and somewhere that felt responsible for it in return. None of that is impossible. Iceland itself was settled within living memory of the Vinland voyages, beginning from nothing and building in a generation to a population capable of sustaining itself against bad winters, bad harvests, and the ordinary erosions of mortality. The mechanisms for making that happen were already understood. The difference is that Iceland was close enough and large enough and attractive enough that the necessary investment was made consistently by enough families over enough years that the threshold was crossed before it could be reversed. Vinland needed the same sustained commitment, and it never got it. Not because the land refused them, but because the distance was long, the stakes were uncertain, and the people making the decisions were always calculating the cost of crossing that distance against the benefit of what was on the other side. The colony that could have survived was never out of reach. It simply required more than any single voyage could carry. But population thresholds and export commodities only describe half of the equation. The other half was already there, living on the land, fishing the same rivers, hunting the same coasts, and making decisions of their own. Any Norse colony that survived long enough to cross the threshold of permanence would have done so inside an indigenous world that was neither empty nor passive. The Mi'kmaq, Beothuk and Wabanaki peoples who controlled the resource-rich bays and river mouths of Newfoundland and the Gulf of St. Lawrence were not simply obstacles to be overcome or background figures in a Norse story. They were political actors with their own networks, their own strategic calculations, and their own reasons to engage or resist a new group of iron-working strangers who had arrived on the edge of their territory. Any realistic vision of a sustained Norse presence in North America begins not with what the Norse wanted, but with what that encounter might have actually produced between two sets of people, who each had something the other could use. The sagas give us the word "skraeling," a term applied broadly and without much precision to the indigenous peoples encountered at Vinland, and they give us a handful of exchanges that oscillate uneasily between trade and violence. Red cloth passed between groups. Weapons were raised and lowered. Someone misjudged a gesture and blood was spilled. These fragments are too sparse and too mythologized to serve as reliable ethnography, but they point towards something recognizable in the history of contact zones everywhere. The early period of any sustained encounter is defined less by ideology than by improvisation, by both sides reading unfamiliar signals and making costly errors alongside occasional productive agreements. What a permanent colony would have forced, over years rather than weeks, is the slow development of something more structured. Consider the mechanics of it. A Norse community of 150 people, dependent on the surrounding land for game, timber and fresh water, and unable to resupply itself entirely from Greenland, would have needed workable relationships with its neighbours simply to function through a hard winter. That pressure alone tends to produce results. Translators emerge from children who grow up hearing two languages. Seasonal markets establish themselves at neutral points between territories, places where exchange is understood to take precedence over grievance, at least temporarily. Hostage exchanges, one of the most durable diplomatic technologies of the medieval world, create mutual accountability between groups who cannot yet fully trust each other, but cannot afford open war. The Norse used this mechanism extensively across the North Atlantic world. There is no particular reason to imagine they would have failed to reach for it here. The main penny already hints at how such a network might have functioned. That small silver coin of Olaf Kyrre, minted between 1067 and 1093, travelled from its Norse point of origin to a Native American coastal settlement in what is now Maine, moving not in the hand of a Norse trader walking south, in all likelihood, but through the layered indigenous exchange networks that connected coastal communities across hundreds of miles of shoreline. Metal moved along those networks because it was rare and therefore valuable, and the Norse controlled the closest source of worked iron and silver on the continent. A permanent colony would not merely have produced metal objects, it would have become a node in the existing exchange system, a place where indigenous traders arrived with furs, food surpluses and local knowledge, and departed with iron tools, ornaments and occasionally cloth. That kind of relationship is not the same as alliance, and it is not the same as friendship. It is a frontier economy, and frontier economies are always unstable in specific ways. The same trading relationship that makes a Norse outpost valuable to its indigenous neighbours also makes it a target when the terms of exchange become exploitative, when disease moves through a community that has no immunity and no explanation for what is killing it, or when a season of poor harvest drives one side toward raiding what the other side refuses to sell. The Norse sagas themselves are frank about the fragility of these arrangements at Vinland, describing escalations that came quickly and without obvious resolution. A longer-term settlement would have encountered that fragility repeatedly, and its survival would have depended on developing institutional responses to it that went beyond the individual judgment of whoever happened to be in charge at a given moment. Indigenous political geography would have shaped which Norse outposts survived and which did not, in ways that go well beyond simple military contest. The coastal zones of Newfoundland and the Gulf of St. Lawrence were not uniformly controlled or uniformly inhabited. There were areas where one group's authority was strong enough to either protect or threaten a Norse settlement decisively, and there were boundary zones between polities where a small foreign community might exist in a kind of political interstitial space, claimed by no one and therefore tolerated by several. Norse settlers in the North Atlantic had a long history of recognizing and exploiting exactly these kinds of political gaps. Iceland's landnam was in part a story of settlers identifying uninhabited or contested terrain, and moving into it before anyone could effectively object. The same instinct applied in a different geography might have produced Norse communities in locations that were strategically chosen not just for harbour quality and timber access, but for their position relative to indigenous territorial boundaries. Intermarriage is the most contested element of this imagined frontier, partly because the genomic evidence for Norse Greenland shows no detectable Norse ancestry in later indigenous populations, which suggests that if intermarriage occurred, it did not produce lineages that survived in detectable form. But absence of genetic evidence is not evidence of absence in the social sense. What the genomic record tells us is something about scale and continuity, not about whether individuals crossed cultural boundaries in the short term. Frontier zones throughout history have generated personal relationships, children, and cultural borrowing long before those things show up in population-level genetic data. Norse loanwords might have entered coastal vocabularies. Indigenous knowledge of tides, seasons, and migratory routes would have been indispensable to any Norse community that lasted more than a decade. The transfer of practical knowledge is often the most durable exchange of all, far harder to see in the archaeological record than iron nails or silver coins, but far more consequential for the people living through it. Disease is the frontier risk that most resists easy modelling, because its effects depend on variables that no one could have predicted or controlled. Indigenous communities in the contact zone would have had no prior exposure to the range of pathogens that even a small Norse community carried as ordinary background biology. Whether that produced catastrophic mortality comparable to later European contact events, or something more localised and survivable, depends on transmission patterns, population density, and the specific mix of organisms involved, none of which can be reconstructed with confidence for an 11th century scenario. What can be said is that disease transmission would not have been one-directional or simultaneous. It would have moved unevenly through connected communities over years, reshaping the political landscape in ways that neither side could fully understand, sometimes creating power vacuums that a Norse colony might exploit, sometimes eliminating the very trading partners and diplomatic interlocutors that made Norse survival possible in the first place. The most plausible frontier is not a neat story of either domination or harmony. It is a patchwork. Some Norse outposts absorbed gradually into indigenous exchange networks, to the point where their Norse character fades over generations. Others destroyed or abandoned after a single severe breakdown in relations. others persisting in uneasy equilibrium for decades, neither fully integrated nor fully isolated, sustained by the mutual recognition that the arrangement was more useful than the alternative. The Norse were not conquerors in this scenario because they lacked the numbers and the institutional depth to conquer anything. They were also not simply welcome guests because they occupied land, consumed resources, and carried risks that their neighbours could not fully account for. They were something harder to categorise and historically more interesting. A small, technically capable foreign community navigating a world that had its own logic, its own hierarchies, and its own judgment about who was worth dealing with. That negotiation, rather than any single moment of discovery or conflict, is where the real history of a surviving Norse America would have lived. That negotiation at the frontier's edge, however intricate and consequential it might have been in North America, would have registered in Europe as barely a whisper. And that silence is itself one of the most revealing things about how a surviving Vinland colony would have actually functioned in the medieval world. Distance alone does not explain the silence. Norse sailors had already proven that distance was negotiable. What made Vinland peripheral to European consciousness was a layered problem involving communication technology, institutional reach, and the fundamental indifference of power centres to events that did not directly threaten or enrich them. Medieval Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries was not a world of broadcast information. News moved through relay networks of messengers, monks, and merchants, and even the most sophisticated of these systems had hard limits. The Saxon messenger network of the late 11th century could move information roughly 70 miles a day through a mesh of towns and monasteries, an impressive achievement for its time, but one that required a continuous chain of populated nodes. Beyond Iceland, that chain broke down entirely. Greenland lay at the edge of what any European administrative or ecclesiastical system could practically monitor, and Vinland lay beyond even that. Literacy compounded the problem. The Norse Atlantic colonies produced almost no contemporary written record of themselves. What survives of Greenland comes primarily from Icelandic sagas composed a century or more after the events they describe, shaped by oral tradition, narrative convention, and the storytelling priorities of communities that were themselves far from any European centre of learning. A Vinland settlement would have been even more remote from the scribal culture of continental monasteries and royal chanceries. If a Norse community on the coast of Newfoundland had its own internal sense of continuity and identity, that sense was carried in memory and practice rather than in parchment. Europe would not have heard from it directly. It would have heard about it occasionally through chains of retelling that accumulated distortion at every link. And yet Europe was not entirely unaware that something existed beyond Iceland and Greenland. The establishment of the Garda diocese in Greenland in 1124, with its first resident bishop ordained and its administrative connection running through the metropolitan of Lund and later Nidaros, represents exactly the kind of institutional tentacle that medieval ecclesiastical organisation was capable of extending into marginal territory. The Church had both the motivation and the mechanism to reach where secular royal authority could not. Tithes needed to be collected. Souls needed to be counted. The last resident bishop of Gardar died in 1378, and papal correspondence continued to acknowledge the diocese even when direct contact was becoming increasingly intermittent. A functioning Vinland settlement connected through Greenland would eventually have fallen within the orbit of this ecclesiastical structure, not because Rome particularly cared about a few hundred Norse settlers on the far edge of the ocean, but because the Church's administrative logic was expansionist by default. Once a community existed, it needed a priest. Once a priest existed, the diocese wanted its revenue. That connection would have been slow and irregular, but it would have mattered. Church structures were among the primary mechanisms by which peripheral communities became legible to the broader European world. A settlement that received a visiting priest, paid its ecclesiastical dues in walrus ivory or furs, and maintained nominal contact with the Greenlandic diocese would gradually accumulate a paper existence, a presence in letters and ledgers, even if the community itself remained entirely unchanged in its daily character. This is how medieval Europe absorbed its margins, not through conquest or deliberate integration, but through the slow expansion of record-keeping institutions that needed something to record. Royal authority was a different and considerably weaker instrument at this range. The Norwegian crown had a theoretical claim over the Norse Atlantic settlements, periodically reasserted but practically difficult to enforce across hundreds of miles of open ocean. What the Crown could do was regulate the trade that these settlements generated, and it was through trade rather than governance that Vinland goods would most plausibly have entered European awareness. Walrus ivory is the key commodity here. DNA, analysis of medieval European walrus ivory, has demonstrated that from roughly 1100 CE onward, nearly all of it can be traced to the western Atlantic populations harvested by Norse Greenlanders. That ivory moved through Bergen and Trondheim, reaching markets in Dublin, London and Schleswig, financing the Greenlandic diocese and sustaining the small Norse communities at the western edge of the known world. A Vinland outpost that produced additional walrus ivory, or that contributed timber, furs and seabird feathers to the Greenlandic export economy, would have fed into these same routes without anyone in Bergen needing to know precisely where the goods originated. The merchant who bought walrus tusks in Trondheim was not tracking a supply chain. He was buying a luxury commodity and moving it south. Vinland, in this scenario, was invisible at the point of sale, its products absorbed into existing categories under existing labels. This is the crucial distinction between a real but peripheral colony and the later imperial models of expansion that would reshape the Atlantic world after 1492, when Portugal and Spain established colonies in Africa, Asia and the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries. They did so with the apparatus of centralized states, royal charters, joint stock companies, and administrative hierarchies that created documentation, asserted ownership, and extracted resources in ways that were deliberately legible to the sponsoring power. The colony existed not just as a physical settlement, but as a legal and economic entity connected by explicit institutional ties to a metropolitan centre that monitored, taxed, and directed it. A Norse Vinland settlement would have had none of this. It would have been a community that sustained itself, traded through networks it did not control, and remained meaningful to the people living in it without ever becoming a project, in the sense that later European colonialism understood that word. Merchant interests might eventually have tightened this loose arrangement. If Vinland timber, already prized for being straighter and more abundant than anything available in Greenland or Iceland, began arriving in Norwegian ports in sufficient quantities to attract attention, the commercial logic of formalizing that supply could have drawn investors into a more deliberate relationship with the colony. Medieval merchant networks in Bergen and the Hanseatic ports were sophisticated enough to organize regular supply voyages to profitable sources once profitability was demonstrated. But this required a threshold of volume and reliability that a small frontier settlement would have struggled to reach. The same distance and communication limits that kept the colony invisible to political authority also kept it below the threshold of commercial visibility. Goods trickled out through Greenland. They did not flow in quantities that demanded institutional response. What you get if you run this logic forward across 2 or 3 generations of a surviving Vinland colony is a community that is real, functional, and entirely marginal. Not marginal in the dismissive sense, not unimportant to the people living in it, but marginal in the systemic sense, operating below the level of resolution at which European institutions habitually focused. It would have appeared in saga fragments, in the occasional papal letter about the difficulty of reaching the Greenlandic diocese, in the walrus ivory entering Bergen from unnamed western waters. Its goods would have circulated in European markets without its name attached to them. Its people would have developed relationships and economies and genealogies that mattered intensely on the ground, and almost not at all to any chronicler sitting in a European monastery trying to make sense of the world. The contrast with later Atlantic empires is not merely a difference of scale, it is a difference of kind. Later colonies were instruments of states that had both the capacity and the intention to project power across oceans. A Norse Vinland settlement would have been something older and in some ways stranger, a community sustained by kinship, necessity, and the logic of the sea, connected to Europe by threads of ivory and rumour, known to its neighbours far better than it was known to the civilization it had nominally left behind. Those threads of ivory and rumour, however resilient they seemed across 2 or 3 generations, were always being pulled taut by forces that no Norse settler or Bergen merchant could negotiate with. Around the middle of the 13th century, the climate of the North Atlantic began to change in ways that would eventually overwhelm the entire Norse-Western enterprise, not through a single catastrophe, but through a slow, grinding accumulation of cold. The trigger, as best as modern science can reconstruct it, was volcanic. In 1257 and 1258, The eruption of Somalis on the Indonesian island of Lombok injected an extraordinary volume of sulfur and ash into the stratosphere, enough to veil sunlight across both hemispheres for years. Volcanic winters of this magnitude are rare even in geological time, and the Somalis event was among the largest of the last 2,000 years. The cooling it caused did not immediately reverse. Instead, it set off a feedback cycle in which expanding Arctic sea ice reflected more sunlight back into space, reinforcing the cold that had created it. What began as a volcanic incident became something structural, the onset of what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long regime of lower temperatures, shortened growing seasons, and ice-choked northern seas that would persist in varying intensity until the 19th century. For Norse Greenland, the consequences were not abstract. The island's two main settlements, the eastern and western, had been built on a narrow agricultural foundation. The Norse had found, in their first generations there, that certain fjords and valleys offered surprisingly workable pasture land, enough to sustain cattle, sheep, and goats through the summer months and into the early autumn. The farms were never generous by European standards, but they were viable. As the Little Ice Age tightened its grip, that viability eroded. Home field pastures shrank in productivity. Hay yields declined precisely when the need for winter fodder was growing. Livestock mortality rose. The seasonal window within which a Norse farmer could do meaningful agricultural work compressed from already short to barely adequate. At the same time, the sea itself was becoming less navigable. Summer sea ice, which in earlier centuries had been a problem mainly for the highest latitude voyages, began pressing southward into waters that Norse sailors had previously crossed with reasonable confidence. The annual journey to the Nordsita hunting grounds around Disco Bay, already a challenging expedition into Arctic waters, now required navigating ice that could linger into July, stretching what had been a difficult journey into one that might cost 15 to 27 days of hazardous travel through conditions that could trap or crush a wooden vessel. The sailing window that connected Greenland to Iceland and through Iceland to Norway narrowed. Voyages that had once been merely arduous became genuinely dangerous, and the frequency of contact between Greenland and the broader Norse world declined accordingly. What makes the Norse Greenlandic story more nuanced than a simple narrative of failure is what the bones of the dead actually reveal. Isotopic analysis of human remains from Greenlandic cemeteries documents a dietary transformation that speaks to remarkable adaptability under stress. In the 11th century, Norse Greenlanders ate primarily terrestrial food, the dairy and meat products of their own farms supplemented by game. By the 13th century, something like 40% of their caloric intake was coming from marine sources. By the final phase of the settlements, somewhere around 1450, that proportion had climbed to roughly 80%. These people were not starving passively. They were reorienting their entire economy around the sea, pursuing harp seals, walrus, and fish with an intensity that their ancestors would not have recognized as Norse farming life. Archaeological records confirm this shift, showing a sharp increase in seal and walrus exploitation from around 1300 onward, accompanied by evidence of communal seal drives and the organized use of hunting dogs for caribou. The culture was adapting, bending rather than breaking, at least for a time. But adaptation has limits that are set not just by ingenuity, but by numbers, time, and connection. As farms became less productive, the labour supply available for long maritime hunting expeditions was itself under pressure. The seasonal calendar grew brutally compressed. The brief summer months that were needed simultaneously for agricultural work, haymaking, and the longboat voyages to northern hunting grounds could not be stretched to accommodate all three without strain. A community losing people to cold winters, failed harvests, and the ordinary attrition of frontier life could not easily replace them. Greenland had no reservoir of immigration to draw on. The Norse Atlantic settlements were always thin on the ground, and as conditions worsened, thin became thinner. This is where the question of Vinland becomes something more than historical curiosity. If a Norse settlement had taken root on the North American coast and survived into the 13th and 14th centuries, what would it have meant for a Greenland under environmental siege? Vinland's climate, even accounting for the general cooling of the Little Ice Age, would have remained considerably milder than Greenland's. The forests that had struck the original Norse explorers as almost miraculous in their abundance were still there. The marine resources off the Newfoundland and Labrador coasts were among the richest in the Atlantic world. A community established there would have faced hardship as temperatures dropped, but not the same existential agricultural collapse that threatened Greenland's pastoral economy. In principle, Vinland could have served as a refuge, a place where a Norse population squeezed out of Greenland's failing farms might find something closer to the conditions their grandparents had relied on. The problem is that reaching Vinland required crossing the same ocean that was becoming more dangerous to cross. The sea ice that strangled the Greenland-Iceland route did not stop at Greenland's coasts. The broader North Atlantic was becoming a more hostile navigational environment, and the western routes that connected Greenland to Labrador and Newfoundland ran through waters that were themselves susceptible to seasonal ice and worsening storm patterns. A community in Vinland, however environmentally favoured, was still at the end of a maritime supply chain that depended on regular contact with Greenland, and Greenland depended on regular contact with Iceland and Norway. Climate stress did not attack just one node in that network, it attacked the connective tissue between all of them. There is also the question of what sustained any Norse-Western venture economically. Walrus ivory had been the primary commodity justifying the expense and risk of Greenland and Vinland expeditions. But the same period that saw the Little Ice Age intensify also saw European markets for walrus ivory begin to shift. As elephant ivory from African trade routes became more accessible to European merchants in the 14th century, the relative value of the Arctic product declined. The economic rationale that had made Greenland's dangerous northern hunting expeditions worthwhile was eroding at exactly the moment when those expeditions were becoming more physically difficult and more demographically costly. A Vinland colony caught within this web of pressures would have faced a reckoning that its founders could not have anticipated. Environmental generosity in the Western settlement could soften the blow, but it could not replace the network that gave the settlement its wider meaning. A community that could feed itself but could no longer reliably communicate, trade, or receive new people from the east was not a thriving colony. It was an island in a larger sense than geography alone, cut off not by water but by the slow foreclosure of viable connection. The Norse who adapted most brilliantly to the changing conditions, who shifted their diet toward the sea and organised their communities around marine hunting, were demonstrating exactly the kind of resilience that might have extended a Vinland settlement's life well beyond Greenland's eventual end. But resilience and permanence are different things. What climate accomplished, over 2 centuries of patient pressure, was not the sudden destruction of Norse-Western communities, but the gradual severing of the threads that held the entire Atlantic enterprise together. And once those threads were gone, no amount of local ingenuity could fully replace what they had provided. So consider the branching point. Greenland's last known written record is a wedding ceremony, conducted at Valsey Church on the 14th of September, 1408, a marriage documented in letters that somehow made their way back to Iceland and survived. After that, silence. The western settlement was already empty by around 1340. The eastern settlement persisted longer, but by 1450 the farms were abandoned, the churches cold, and the people simply gone, absorbed into death or departure, or, in some theories, into the indigenous communities of the Arctic. The most elaborate Norse enterprise in the Western Ocean had ended not with a battle or a catastrophe, but with a quiet cessation, the last fire burning out without anyone left to notice. But imagine the threads had not all frayed at once. Imagine that somewhere along the Newfoundland and Labrador coasts, a Norse community had put down roots deep enough to outlast the collapse of its eastern connections. Not a large community, not a prosperous one by the standards of Bergen or even Reykjavik, but a living one, numbering perhaps a few hundred souls who had learned over generations to take what the land and sea offered and ask little of the world beyond their own harbours. What would have happened to them as Greenland went silent and the supply chain from Europe became a memory rather than a lifeline? The first and most immediate change would have been in diet, and the bones of the Norse Greenlanders suggest what that transformation looked like in practice. Isotopic analysis of Greenlandic remains shows that by the final phase of those settlements, roughly 80% of caloric intake was coming from marine sources: seal meat, fish, whale, walrus. People who had arrived as farmers with cattle and sheep were leaving centuries later as something closer to maritime hunters, a Vinland community facing the same pressures but with access to the extraordinary productivity of the Grand Banks and the Gulf of St. Lawrence would have undergone a comparable, perhaps even more complete transition. The North American coast was not a lean environment. It was among the richest coastal ecologies in the Atlantic world, dense with cod, seal, migratory waterfowl, and the same walrus herds whose ivory had once financed the entire Norse Western venture. A community that reoriented entirely around these resources would not have starved. It would have eaten differently than its Norse ancestors, but it would have eaten. The deeper transformation, though, would have been cultural rather than dietary. A community cut off from Europe does not simply maintain European culture under difficult conditions. It drifts, and that drift accelerates with each generation that grows up knowing only the coast in front of them rather than the world their grandparents sailed from. The Norse who settled Meadows in 1021 brought with them a complete cultural package. Old Norse language, a Christian faith recently acquired, the political hierarchies of chieftains and jarls, clinker-built ships built to specifications developed over centuries in Scandinavian fjords. Within a few generations of isolation, each of those elements would have begun to change under pressure from the actual environment and the actual neighbours. Language adapts first and fastest. There were no universities in Vinland, no scriptoria producing manuscripts to anchor the language in written form. Old Norse would have bent toward the sounds and concepts that the New World demanded, borrowing words for animals, plants, weather patterns, and coastline features from the indigenous peoples who had been naming these things for thousands of years before any Norse ship appeared on the horizon. The sagas record the Norse term for the people they encountered as Skraelings, a word whose origins and precise meaning remain debated. But what the archaeological record suggests is that the relationship was never simply antagonistic. Norse objects, including that genuine 11th century silver penny of Olaf III that travelled as far as the Goddard site in Maine, moved through indigenous trade networks across enormous distances. Goods travelled because relationships existed. Over generations, in a community dependent on those relationships for survival, the boundary between Norse and Indigenous would have become something more porous than either party's traditions anticipated. The ships themselves would have changed. Norse clinker-built vessels were masterpieces of their tradition, flexible and seaworthy in the open North Atlantic, but they were also products of a shipbuilding culture with access to specific timber supplies and iron fittings that required regular replacement. Genetic analysis of walrus ivory published in 2024 confirmed that Norse maritime operations in the high Arctic involved both small six-oared boats and larger expeditionary vessels, suggesting a flexible approach to different conditions. A Vinland community, deprived of regular iron imports and working with the timber of North American forests rather than Norwegian spruce, would have improvised. Elements of Thule Inuit watercraft design, the low-profile hull, the use of sealskin for waterproofing, the adaptation of the kayak's stability principle to coastal navigation, would have been observed, borrowed, and gradually integrated into whatever the Vinland people were building. The result, after several generations, would have been something neither Norse nor Indigenous, a hybrid maritime technology evolved specifically for the coasts it served. Political culture would have undergone its own evolution, and perhaps the most interesting one. Norse society in the homeland was organised around a complex interplay of chieftain authority, royal power, and ecclesiastical hierarchy. In Greenland, the bishop at Gardar had represented the church's reach into the far west. In a surviving Vinland community, with bishops long since gone and no king whose authority could be enforced across 3,000 miles of hostile ocean, political power would have settled at the local level. A council of families, probably, the heads of the lineages that had survived the hardest years, governing by consensus and by the kind of practical authority that comes from knowing the land and commanding the respect of people who depend on you. This is not unlike the governance structures that existed in the indigenous societies around them, and the convergence would have been reinforcing. Trade requires trust, and trust requires recognizable social structures on both sides of an exchange. A Vinland community that developed governance resembling, at least in practice, the council-based structures of its neighbours would have been a more viable trading partner and therefore a more viable community. What this means is that the survival of Vinland would not have looked like the preservation of Norse culture in amber. It would have looked like transformation, the kind that turns one thing gradually into something else, without any single moment of obvious change. The language spoken in Vinland harbours by the year 1300 would have been Norse at its skeleton, recognisable in grammar and core vocabulary, but encrusted with borrowings and local innovations that a visitor from Norway would have struggled to follow. The Christianity these people maintained would have been a practical, localised faith far from Rome's reach. perhaps incorporating ritual elements borrowed from the spiritual practices of neighbouring peoples. The ships they built would have carried Norse lines modified by local necessity. The food they ate would have come almost entirely from the sea and the forest around them, rather than from the European agricultural tradition their ancestors had tried to transplant. Viking survival in this scenario stops meaning what it usually means in popular imagination: the longship and the helmet and the warrior code preserved intact on a foreign shore. It means something more interesting and more human. A people who arrived with one identity and, through the slow pressure of geography, climate, isolation and contact, became something their ancestors would barely have recognized. The question of whether that still counts as Norse survival is partly semantic and partly profound. The genes were there. The memory of origin was there, dimming with each generation but not entirely gone, the way a language retains traces of the tongue it was before it became itself. What changed was everything that lived on top of that foundation. Greenland fell, and when it fell, Europe lost its last living thread to the Western Ocean. But in this branching scenario, the people who stayed on the American coast did not fall. They transformed, quietly and without witnesses, into something the medieval world had no category for. A hybrid Atlantic culture facing not east toward the continent that had sent them, but west and south toward the continent that had received them. By the time Christopher Columbus stood on a Caribbean beach in October 1492 and claimed it for Castile, nearly 5 centuries had passed since Leif Erikson's ships first rounded the headlands of Newfoundland. In our branching history, where a transformed Norse-Indigenous community had been quietly living on the North American coast through all of that time, what would Columbus's arrival have meant? And more immediately, what traces would 470 years of habitation have left on the Atlantic world that preceded him? The first change would have been cartographic. Norse geographic knowledge of the Western Ocean did not simply vanish after the settlements were abandoned in the real historical record. By 1570, a mapmaker in Iceland had already produced the Skalholt map, naming Vinland, Markland and Helluland with Latinized precision, demonstrating that Atlantic knowledge, however distorted by legend and tradition, persisted in European scholarly culture long after the voyages themselves had ended. The so-called Vinland map, that 15th century document later revealed as a modern forgery, is itself instructive in one sense. The forger knew that a map showing a Western land would be plausible to medieval and early modern scholars, because the rumour of that land had never entirely died. In a world where Vinland had actually survived, the cartographic record would have been richer, harder to dismiss, fed by occasional contact between Norse-descended communities and Icelandic or Norwegian fishermen who strayed far enough west. The Western land on 15th century European maps would not have been a vague rumour or a legendary echo. It would have had contours, coasts, and perhaps names recognisable to any Icelander who had heard old family stories. John Cabot sailed for Newfoundland in 1497, 5 years after Columbus, and contemporary accounts suggest his crew found timber and iron in ways that implied earlier activity. In the real world, that inference is uncertain, but in our hypothetical, Cabot would not have been puzzling over ambiguous evidence. He would have arrived at a coast that bore visible signs of extended habitation, cleared ground, perhaps rough structures built in styles that blended Norse and indigenous techniques, middens containing iron scraps and carved bone, the remains of boat launches oriented toward fishing grounds the local people had been working for generations. Whether the Norse-descended community had survived intact or had been absorbed so completely into indigenous society that only material traces remained, the coast would have looked inhabited rather than empty, which changes everything about how the English crown would have framed its claim. Martin Frobisher, sailing Labrador's coast in the 1570s, recorded indigenous oral accounts of Kablunaat, white men in that region, a memory that some scholars have interpreted as lingering traces of Norse contact. In a world where that contact had been continuous rather than fragmentary, those oral traditions would have been far more specific and far more recent. Frobisher's expedition would not have been collecting faint rumours. It would have been encountering peoples who could describe, from living memory, what the Norse-descended settlements looked like, what they traded, and when they last had contact with the wider Atlantic world. The fisheries question is perhaps the most practically consequential. The Grand Banks cod fishery, when Basque and English and Portuguese fishermen began exploiting it seriously in the early 16th century, was presented as a discovery of enormous productive richness. But in our scenario, that richness was not undiscovered. A surviving Norse-descended community would have been working those waters for centuries, likely trading dried and salted cod south and east along the indigenous coastal networks, and perhaps maintaining enough seafaring capacity to make occasional contact with Icelandic or Faroese fishermen. The presence of established fishing communities with local knowledge would have created a very different dynamic for the European fleets arriving to exploit the banks. There would have been people to negotiate with, or to dispossess, and the legal and diplomatic architecture of early European colonialism would have had to grapple with prior occupancy that was recognisably, however distantly, European in origin. That recognisability matters enormously for the question of missionary routes and colonial diplomacy. Spanish and Portuguese expansion after 1492 operated on a framework that divided the non-Christian world into territory available for conquest. A Norse-descended community, even one 4 centuries removed from formal Christian practice and deeply hybridized with indigenous culture, would have complicated that framework. They would have retained, in whatever form, some memory of Christian origin. They might have practiced something that looked to a Jesuit or a Franciscan like corrupted Christianity rather than paganism, which would have placed them in an entirely different canonical category. The debates within the Spanish Church over the rights of indigenous peoples, the arguments of Bartolomé de las Casas, the legal fictions of the encomienda system, all of these would have been tangled further by the existence of people on the American coast with partial European ancestry and a recognisably European strand in their cultural memory. Yet none of this should lead to the conclusion that a surviving Vinland would have triggered early European conquest of the North American continent. This is the crucial point, and it is easy to miss it when imagining the Viking scenario through the lens of what actually happened after 1492. The forces that made post-Columbian colonization so catastrophic were not simply European ambition, though that was real. They were the combination of ambition with oceanic navigational technology that had matured over the 15th century under Portuguese and Spanish investment, with agricultural and livestock systems capable of rapidly transforming ecosystems, with legal and financial infrastructure for funding and sustaining transoceanic enterprises, and above all with the epidemiological catastrophe of diseases against which American populations had no immunity. A Norse-descended community on the Newfoundland coast, numbering perhaps a few hundred souls at most, and having lived in intimate contact with its indigenous neighbours for generations, would have represented none of these forces. Its members would likely have shared, through centuries of proximity and intermarriage, a degree of immunological commonality with the peoples around them. Its European connection was a memory rather than a pipeline for the pathogens and institutions of the Old World. The comparison with what actually occurred after 1492 is instructive in its scale. When Spanish forces moved through the Caribbean and then the mainland, they were backed by the military, financial, and bureaucratic machinery of states that could sustain transoceanic supply chains, recruit soldiers across a continent, and extract resources at industrial volume. When English and French colonization began in earnest in the 17th century, it came with land-clearing agricultural systems, livestock that transformed landscapes within years, and waves of immigration that numbered in the tens of thousands. Against these forces, even a thriving and sophisticated indigenous civilization struggled to survive. A small Norse-descended coastal community, however interesting historically, however useful as a diplomatic interlocutor or a source of local geographic knowledge, would have been absorbed into this new order rather than shaping it fundamentally. It might have bought certain indigenous trading partners an extra generation of contact on their own terms. It would not have stopped the tide. What it might have done is alter the mythology. Columbus returned to Europe in 1493 claiming he had reached Asia, a fiction maintained for years in the face of mounting geographic evidence. The mythology of discovery, of a world unknown to Europeans suddenly made known, was central to the legal and moral justifications for everything that followed. In a world where European sailors had been occasionally hearing, for a century or more, about Norse-descended settlements on the western coast, that mythology would have been harder to sustain. The Western Ocean would have been not unknown but half-known, a place with a history that predated Castilian ambition. Whether that would have produced a more cautious engagement with the Americas, or simply a different set of rationalizations for the same impulses, is a question that probably answers itself. The coast that Columbus never reached, the North Atlantic shore where a transformed Norse community quietly persisted, would not have saved the Americas from Europe. but it would have ensured that Europe arrived knowing, at least in part, that someone was already there, and had been there, for a very long time. The question of who first reached America has never been purely historical. It carries weight that pure history rarely does, touching identity, pride, and the stories that nations and communities tell about themselves. And because that weight is real, the evidence surrounding Norse America has attracted not only careful scholarship, but also something less disciplined: the desire to find proof that matches the story already believed. The memory of Vinland did not simply fade after the settlements were abandoned. It survived in two Icelandic sagas, the Greenlandinga saga and Erik's saga Rauda, both written down in the 13th century, but drawing on oral traditions that stretched back to the voyages themselves. These texts preserve the names of places, the descriptions of wild grapes and self-sown wheat, the encounters with the Skraelings, and the personality of Leif Erikson with enough internal consistency to suggest a genuine historical core. But they were also shaped by the literary conventions of their time, by the priorities of the scribes who recorded them, and by 2 or 3 centuries of oral retelling that compressed, dramatized, and occasionally invented. Scholars have spent generations trying to separate the geographical fact from the narrative embellishment, and the boundary remains genuinely contested. That ambiguity, that space between documented history and compelling legend, is exactly where mythology finds room to grow. By the 19th century, the sagas had taken on a new life. Scandinavian immigration to North America was accelerating, and with it came a cultural desire to claim not just residency, but priority. If Norse voyagers had reached the continent 5 centuries before Columbus, then Scandinavian Americans were not latecomers to someone else's story. They were, in a sense, returning to a land their ancestors had touched first. This was not an idle sentiment. It found expression in statues, in commemorative events, in the naming of streets and civic institutions, and eventually in organised lobbying campaigns that successfully established Leif Erikson Day as an American national observance. Vinland had become, as one scholar put it, a free-floating yet powerful signifier, available to be shaped by whoever needed it, and whatever argument was being made. That need for a Viking past produced, inevitably, fabricated evidence. The most durable and instructive example is the Kensington runestone, uncovered in 1898 by a Swedish-American farmer in Minnesota. The stone bore runic inscriptions describing a Norse expedition of 1362 that had travelled deep into the continent, with several members killed by indigenous peoples. It was exactly the kind of artifact that the moment wanted: dramatic, specific, and apparently ancient. Runologists examined it and found the inscriptions linguistically inconsistent with 14th century Norse, using grammatical forms and runic variants that did not exist in medieval Scandinavia. Geologists who studied the weathering patterns concluded the carving was recent. Historians pointed out that no corroborating documentary evidence supported a 1362 expedition anywhere near Minnesota. The scholarly consensus settled firmly on hoax, almost certainly produced in the late 19th century by someone steeped in the romantic nationalism of the era. And yet the Kensington runestone has never entirely gone away. It sits in a museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, attracts visitors, and continues to generate literature arguing for its authenticity. The desire for the stone to be real has proved more durable than the evidence against it. The Vinland map followed a different trajectory but illustrated the same dynamic. Publicised in 1965 as a 15th century document depicting North America before Columbus, it was presented as confirmation that European cartographers knew of the western lands well before the Spanish expeditions. The timing was significant. Coming in the midst of debates over Columbus Day and the politics of heritage, the map offered Scandinavian and pre-Columbian enthusiasts a powerful visual argument. When X-ray fluorescence analysis later revealed that the ink contained titanium dioxide in a form only commercially available after the 1920s, the map was exposed as a 20th century forgery. The forger, whoever they were, had understood the cultural appetite for such a document well enough to create something that looked exactly like what people wanted to find. The Maine penny occupies a more genuinely uncertain position in this landscape. This small silver coin, minted during the reign of the Norwegian King Olaf III in the 11th century, was recovered in 1957 at an archaeological site in Brooklyn, Maine, a site otherwise associated with indigenous occupations spanning many centuries. Metallurgical analysis confirmed the coin's Norse origin beyond reasonable doubt. The question is not whether it is a Norse coin, but how it got to Maine, and there the interpretations diverge sharply. The most archaeologically plausible explanation is that the coin travelled through indigenous trade networks, passed from hand to hand across hundreds of miles of coastal and interior exchange routes that connected communities from Newfoundland to New England long before any European arrived. That explanation requires no direct Norse presence in Maine at all, only the existence of trading connections through which a remarkable object moved. But a minority of interpreters have preferred more dramatic readings, and the coin has occasionally been invoked as proof of Norse settlement far south of Newfoundland, a claim the evidence does not sustain. What these episodes share is a pattern: genuine historical possibility inflated by cultural desire into fabricated or overstated certainty. And the pattern is worth examining not to mock the desire but to understand it. The question of who reached America first matters to people because it is not really a question about the past. It is a question about belonging, about whose story the continent is, about how priority and presence translate into legitimacy. Those are live political questions, not dead historical ones, and they produce the conditions in which a Minnesota farmer might carve an ancient-looking stone, or a scholar might fail to subject a map to adequate scrutiny, or a coin's ambiguous provenance might be resolved in whatever direction seems most satisfying. The slower, more painstaking work of archaeology and material science operates against this pressure rather than with it. The excavations at Meadows in Newfoundland, which began in the 1960s under Helga and Ann Stein-Ingstad, produced evidence that was far less dramatic than a runestone in Minnesota, but far more reliable. The remains of Norse-style buildings, iron nails made by a process only used in medieval Scandinavia, a bronze ring-headed pin of the type worn in 11th century Scandinavia, butternuts that could only have come from further south, and suggested the settlement was a staging point for deeper exploration. Then, in 2021, a team using a precise radiocarbon dating technique, tied to a documented solar storm event, established that trees at the site had been felled in exactly 1021 CE. No invented artifact, no nationalist wishful thinking, no forged document produced a result of that precision and reliability. The science simply located a Norse presence in North America to a specific year, 1 millennium before the researchers published their findings. That result is remarkable on its own terms. It does not need embellishment. The real Norse contact with America, confirmed by a convergence of archaeological evidence and cutting-edge isotopic analysis, is a more interesting and more surprising story than the Kensington runestone's fantasy of medieval knights wandering through Minnesota. A small group of Norse seafarers built a camp on the northern tip of Newfoundland in 1021, 5 centuries before Columbus, spent what appears to have been at least one winter there, cut timber and smelted iron, and then left. They encountered peoples who had been living in North America for thousands of years and who had sophisticated trade networks already carrying objects across vast distances. They left traces so faint that they went unnoticed by European scholars for nearly 1,000 years and were only confirmed by science developed in the 21st century. None of that requires a stone with convenient inscriptions or a map with suspicious ink. Public memory keeps returning to the question of who arrived first, because first arrival still feels like it ought to mean something, like it confers a form of ownership or at least of kinship with the land. The Norse voyages complicate that instinct in useful ways. Leif Erikson's crew did not discover an empty continent. They found people already there, already trading, already shaping the landscape to their purposes for millennia. The Norse were not first. They were simply the first to arrive from one particular direction, from across a particular ocean, at a particular and now precisely known moment in the autumn or winter of 1021. That is enough. The real story, once the hoaxes have been set aside and the science allowed to speak, turns out to be stranger, older, and more genuinely astonishing than anything a 19th century forger could have imagined. For most of the 20th century, the Norse presence in North America was framed as a failure story. A small group of seafarers reached a distant shore, encountered resistance they could not overcome, and retreated to Greenland never to return. The settlements withered. The memory survived only in sagas that blended fact with legend. And the conclusion drawn from this was that the Norse were fundamentally out of their depth in the Western Atlantic, farmers who had pushed their agrarian way of life as far as it would go and found that it would not go far enough. That interpretation shaped the popular imagination of Viking America for decades, and it was not entirely wrong, but it was built on a partial picture, and the picture has been changing with remarkable speed. The change began with wood. In 2021, a research team applied a technique called spike dating to timber remnants from Meadows, cross-referencing the tree rings against a documented spike in atmospheric carbon-14 caused by a powerful solar storm in 993 CE. Because that cosmic event left a precisely datable chemical signature in the growth rings of trees across the planet, any wood that contains it can be anchored to a known year with a precision that conventional radiocarbon dating cannot match. The Meadows timber placed the felling of those trees in 1021 CE, not approximately 1021, not within a range spanning several decades, exactly 1021, a date confirmed independently across multiple samples. That result did more than pin a number to a settlement. It reframed the entire question of Norse-Western activity, shifting it from vague possibility to documented historical event, and giving scientists a precise anchor from which to examine everything else. From that anchor, the tools of modern archaeology radiated outward in several directions simultaneously, and each one eroded a different part of the failure narrative. Stable carbon isotope analysis, applied to bone collagen preserved in Norse Greenlandic burial sites, told a story that nobody had fully expected. The Norse who settled Greenland around 985 CE brought with them a European farming culture. Cattle, sheep, goats, the dietary profile of a people rooted in terrestrial agriculture. Early isotopic readings from that period reflect exactly that profile, heavy with the chemical signatures of land-based food sources. But the same analysis applied to remains from the 14th and 15th centuries shows something dramatically different. By the final centuries of the Greenlandic settlements, the Norse there were deriving the majority of their calories from marine sources, from seal, walrus, fish, and the other protein-rich harvests of the North Atlantic. The shift is not subtle. It represents a wholesale reorientation of how these communities fed themselves, and it points to a society far more adaptable than the old model allowed. These were not stubborn farmers clinging to practices that no longer worked. They were people who read their environment and changed. That adaptability matters enormously for the question of Vinland, because the old failure model depended on imagining the Norse as fundamentally inflexible, capable only of replicating European agriculture in places where European agriculture would not take hold. If the isotopic record instead shows us a culture that shifted fluidly toward maritime subsistence when circumstances demanded, then a Western settlement with access to rich fishing grounds, abundant timber, and the same walrus hunting territory that sustained Greenland's economy looks considerably more viable. The resources that Vinland offered were not secondary to what the Norse valued. They were precisely what the Norse had learned through long adaptation to exploit most effectively. Metallurgical analysis extended the picture further. The iron nails at Meadows, produced through a bloomery smelting process distinctive to medieval Scandinavia, confirmed the site's Norse origin through material chemistry rather than saga testimony alone. The bronze pin recovered there matched the typology of 11th century Scandinavian dress accessories with enough precision to function almost as a fingerprint. And the maine penny, that small silver coin of Olaf III's reign, told its own story through metallurgical examination. The analysis confirmed Norse origin beyond reasonable dispute, and the coin's presence at a main site occupied across many centuries suggests the movement of high-value metal objects through indigenous trade networks that extended far beyond Newfoundland. Metal was rare and precious in pre-contact North America. A Norse coin travelling hundreds of miles through indigenous hands was not an anomaly. It was evidence of exactly the kind of long-range commercial exchange that the Norse of this period habitually practiced, and its existence hints at economic connections whose full geography has not yet been mapped. Ancient DNA has added a final dimension to the transformation. Large-scale genomic sequencing of Viking Age individuals from across the Norse world, including Iceland and Greenland, has revealed a population far more genetically diverse and geographically mobile than the stereotype of isolated northern farmers ever suggested. The data show extensive gene flow into and out of Scandinavia, family-structured expedition groups travelling together across the North Atlantic, and the genetic signatures of biological adaptations suited to high-latitude maritime environments. Lactase persistence, the ability to digest dairy into adulthood, was spreading through the population. The Norse were not simply spreading a cultural package across new territories. They were a biologically adaptable, fast-moving, commercially sophisticated people whose reach across the North Atlantic constituted one of the most ambitious maritime enterprises in medieval history. Taken together, these methods have dismantled the failed farmer's model piece by piece and replaced it with something more accurate and considerably more interesting. The Norse of the 11th century who built that settlement on the northern tip of Newfoundland were not the leading edge of a doomed agricultural expansion. They were the western terminus of a maritime trading network that connected Greenland's walrus grounds to European luxury markets, that valued timber for shipbuilding, iron for tools and weapons, and furs for continental trade. Vinland offered all of those things in abundance. The question of why they left is not answered by pointing to their limitations. It requires a more nuanced examination of the pressures, political, demographic, economic, and eventually climatic, that made withdrawal more rational than persistence at any particular moment. And that reframing is what makes the central what-if of this entire conversation genuinely worth asking. If the Norse were not fundamentally unsuited to Western Atlantic settlement, if they were instead a maritime adaptive, resource-flexible society with the commercial incentives to sustain long-range contact, then the question of what might have kept them in North America is no longer a fantasy. It becomes a real historical counterfactual, built on real historical capabilities. The science does not tell us that a permanent Norse presence in America was inevitable. It tells us it was plausible. It tells us that the resources, the adaptations, the commercial motivations, and the navigational skill were all there. What was required was a different combination of circumstances, different political decisions in Greenland, a different configuration of indigenous relations, a marginally more favourable period of climate stability before the Little Ice Age tightened its grip on the North Atlantic. The instruments that have done this work, the mass spectrometers reading isotope ratios in ancient bone, the solar event chronometers anchoring tree rings to specific years, the genome sequencers mapping kinship and migration across medieval populations, were not available to the scholars who first tried to evaluate the Norse presence in America. The people who debated the sagas in the 19th century and the early 20th had only texts, and texts distorted by time and purpose. Now there is bone chemistry and tree chemistry and genetic code, all pointing toward the same revised picture, a Norse Atlantic world that was more expansive, more adaptive, and more commercially driven than anyone imagined. That picture is the foundation on which any serious answer to the question of Viking America must now be built, and it is to that answer, at last, that we can turn. So here we are, at the edge of the question we have been sailing toward across this entire conversation, a ship on a North American shore, a small group of Norse men and women cutting timber, smelting bog iron, watching the tree line for movement. The year is 1021, and we know that with a precision that would have astonished any scholar working a generation ago. What we do not know, and what no instrument yet devised can tell us, is whether what happened next was inevitable. Let us be honest about the odds. A permanent Vinland colony faced genuinely formidable obstacles, and acknowledging them is not the same as dismissing the possibility. The distance from the eastern settlement in Greenland to the northern tip of Newfoundland ran to roughly 3,000 kilometres of open North Atlantic water. In favourable conditions during the medieval warm period when sea ice retreated and storms were marginally less ferocious, that crossing took approximately 27 days. In unfavourable conditions it was a gamble that the sagas record killing real people. Distance was not merely a geographical fact, it was a continuous cost measured in ships, provisions, labour, and the institutional will to sustain a venture across a horizon that offered no quick return. The economics, though, were considerably more promising than the distance alone suggests. A single boatload of walrus ivory recorded in a 1327 document was valued higher than the wool produced by 4,000 Icelandic farms across 6 years. That ratio deserves a moment of consideration. A compact cargo of tusks harvested from animals hunted along a coastline the Norse had learned to read as fluently as any landscape they ever occupied could command the kind of European luxury market price that made the entire North Atlantic enterprise financially coherent. Vinland sat within range of those hunting grounds and added its own inventory. Abundant timber at a time when Greenland had almost none. Bog iron that the Meadows site confirms they were already smelting, wild grape and butternut attesting to a more temperate climate than anything available in the Norse northwest. These were not peripheral amenities. They were the precise resources that an 11th century maritime economy needed most. The indigenous dimension is where the alternate history becomes most consequential and most difficult to model. Norse contact with the Beothuk, the Dorset Paleo-Eskimo, and later Thula Inuit peoples was not simply a series of violent confrontations, though violence certainly occurred. Archaeological evidence shows Norse metal objects moving southward through indigenous trade networks centuries after any direct Norse presence could explain their distribution. The Maine penny, an 11th century silver coin of King Olaf III confirmed as genuine through metallurgical analysis, reached a Maine site occupied by Native Americans across many generations. Metal was rare and transformative in pre-contact North America. Its movement meant something. It meant that even the Norse presence that actually existed, brief and contested as it was, had already generated an exchange network capable of carrying objects hundreds of miles through indigenous hands. A colony that endured long enough to establish stable diplomatic relations rather than chronic raiding would have been embedded in that network in ways we can barely begin to reconstruct. The counterfactual consequence is not necessarily conquest. It is something slower, stranger, and perhaps more durable, a centuries-long frontier of mutual exchange along a coastline that European cartographers would not formally chart for another 400 years. Climate ultimately sets the ceiling on what was plausible. The medieval warm period gave the Norse their window, and the Little Ice Age began closing it around 1250, tightening sea ice, shortening growing seasons, and eventually strangling the walrus, ivory trade that had underwritten Greenland's existence. If Vinland had taken root before that transition, and if Greenland's own collapse around 1400 had redirected rather than simply eliminated Norse Atlantic activity, then the Western settlement might have served as a refuge rather than an afterthought. A community already adapted to North American conditions, already embedded in indigenous trade networks, already capable of sourcing the timber and protein Greenland's farmers lost as the climate cooled, would have had reasons to persist precisely when the Greenlandic settlements had run out of them. What changes in that world by the time Columbus crosses in 1492? Not everything, and probably not the large structures of European expansion, which were driven by forces, Iberian statecraft, Ottoman pressure on eastern trade routes, the economics of Atlantic wind systems, that Norse Vinland could not have redirected from Newfoundland. But the encounter between Europe and the Americas would not have been a first meeting. It would have been a resumption. There would have been a population in the Western Atlantic already shaped by centuries of Norse-Indigenous exchange, already possessing metal tools, already carrying fragments of two cultural worlds in the same hands. The violence that attended Columbus and every expedition that followed was powered in part by the shock of absolute novelty on both sides. Remove that novelty, even partially, and the dynamics of contact shift in ways that history gives us no clean template to predict. The most important change might not have been political at all. It might simply have been the existence of a quiet, persistent Atlantic connection running along the same latitudes that Norse sailors had learned to navigate by the stars and the behaviour of seabirds, maintained by the same economic logic that made walrus ivory worth a 27-day crossing. Not an empire, not a conquest, a trade route, invisible in most of the documents that survive but present in the archaeological record the way the Maine penny is present. Small, durable, and carrying more information than its size suggests. What archaeology has actually proven is narrower, and we should hold that distinction carefully. It has proven that Norse people stood on North American soil in 1021. It has proven they worked iron there, built structures, and left objects that travelled further than they did. It has proven they were capable of the adaptation that a longer presence would have required. What it cannot prove is the counterfactual. The ship on that shore is real. Where it might have led remains precisely and permanently, a question the evidence raises without answering. And that tension between what the record confirms and what it only implies is where the most honest and most interesting version of this history lives.